My guest, for many of you, will need no introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway because, after all, that's my job. Thom Hartmann is one of our leading progressive thinkers, writers, and broadcasters. For many years, his show has been one of the top 10 talk radio shows in the country. He has written at least 32 books, perhaps more by now, the latest of which he's been doing this series called The Hidden History. We've had him on to talk about the Supreme Court and about guns in America. The latest Hidden History book is The Hidden History of the War on Voting. That is the object I hold in my hand now. And without further ado, Thom Hartmann, welcome to the Zero Hour.
Hey, Richard. Great to see you again.
Always great to see you, too. And I want to start with this question, a general question, before we get into this book. I've long felt that the war on voting in this country, which I believe is what most Republican elected, or many Republican elected officials are engaged in right now, is the largest, perhaps the single most severe threat our democracy faces right now. And I wonder why it doesn't get the attention and pushback that's commensurate with the level of urgency. Do you have any general thoughts on that?
Yeah, and some specific ones too, that I'm not sure are in the book. But first of all, I agree with you that this is a serious and consequential threat to democracy in America, and that it has become the principal go-to electoral strategy for the Republican Party. And some years ago, this was back in 2005, I think, or 2006. It was during the Bush administration, and I was on Air America at the time, or my show was on Air America, and myself and a number of other Air America hosts. Randy Rhoads was with me. I don't think Al Franken was there, but maybe he was, and I just don't recall. But there were 3 or 4, maybe 5 of us who went to Washington, D.C. to meet with a group of Democratic senators and a couple of members of Congress. Bernie was there. He was still in the House at the time. And there were a number of senators whose names everybody would recognize. And I brought up the issue of electronic voting machines and redshift, and said, we've been seeing, we saw in the 2002 elections, we saw it much bigger in the 2004 election, particularly in Ohio, that in states with Republican secretaries of state, one of the things that we're seeing consistently is that the exit polls show that Democrats won the election, but when you count the ballots or you count the electronic voting machines, it always shows that Republicans won the election, and thus the term redshift, that the outcome shifts. And I said, well, shouldn't this be front and center? Shouldn't this be a major issue for the Democratic Party? Now, at that point in time, most of us, myself included, were assuming that the biggest cause of the redshift was the electronic voting machines being rigged or tampered with. We've since reconsidered that, which is another topic. But in any case, I said that, and one of the senators said, to us and to their colleagues, she said, we don't really want to highlight the challenges of voting machines and the problem of redshift, because if voters don't think that their vote will be counted, they won't show up to vote, and we don't want to do anything to suppress the vote. So we're not going to make this an issue of ours right now. I found that a very frustrating answer, and I think that this has been going on for 15 more years as a direct consequence of the Democratic Party's failure to push back early on. Can you imagine if the Republicans, if Democrats were closing voting stations in white upper middle class neighborhoods left and right, and knocking wealthy white people off the voting rolls? The kind of absolute hell that would be raised by the Republicans.
If voters in Bel Air, California, or Croton-on-Hudson had to wait 8 hours to vote because they hadn't provided.
Exactly.
No, see, this to me is exactly what I wanted to get to, Thom Hartmann, and I do want to get to a number of the issues you raise in the book. So let's do that. As far as the Democratic silence on this subject, and I share, believe me, I share your frustration. I wonder, because I've tried to discuss this topic with Democratic elected officials too, and I've often wondered whether their reluctance, they may express it the way you describe it there, but I wonder if part of it isn't a kind of, I'm trying to think of the best way to put it, but almost a cognitive leap that some of them are not comfortable making, because it requires them and anyone listening to acknowledge that our democracy is deeply dysfunctional. And it may be that that's just not a comfort area for them, that it requires going out of their comfort zone, that they'd rather maintain to themselves and others the fiction that, as some Democratic candidates have put it this year, that if we're only courteous enough to reach across the aisle, our Republican colleagues will work with us, we'll have a functioning democracy. I'm just wondering if it isn't challenging for some Democrats in and out of office to acknowledge that, what, you're being cheated.
Yeah, I think that the 2018 election was a turning point in Georgia. I think that it was widely reported, including in the New York Times and the Washington Post, that Brian Kemp, who was the Secretary of State and thus in charge of elections, had thrown 1 million people off the voting rolls in the preceding years, over about 500,000 just in the year and a half, 2 years before this particular election. That Stacey Abrams, a group aligned with her, had registered to vote over 50,000 African American voters, and they submitted those votes to the Secretary of State's office. And the Secretary of State said, "I'm sorry, we just don't have the manpower to process these until after the election." And then Brian Kemp won the election, in quotes, by 50,000 votes. I think that was the point at which elected Democrats and Democratic officials, people inside the party, said, okay, this is real, and this is something we need to deal with. I think also perhaps a year before that, in 2017, when Trump invited Chris Kobach into the White House and created that commission on voter integrity or vote integrity or voter fraud or whatever he called that commission. And they were unable to find any examples of actual voter fraud. But, we know well the electoral fraud that's going on, specifically this kind of voter suppression.
And again, we're talking with Thom Hartmann about his new book, The Hidden History of the War on Voting. Thom, which gets me to a theme of your book, and I do want to get back to red shifting at some point soon, but I want to go back you begin, part one is about the hidden history of the vote in America. And I was glad you began there, not only in terms of educating readers, but because you begin with the 3/5 compromise, you begin with the racial legacy of the voting process, the Electoral College and slavery, how the Electoral College was created, and so on, and the inextricable link between the Electoral College and our country's history of slavery, women, Native American, others who have had to fight for the right to vote. And I think that's very important in setting the context for today's debate, because the other dimension of this, of course, that goes unmentioned or not mentioned nearly enough, is that whether for pragmatic reasons, because they want to steal, in my words, elections, or because of racism, and I think you address both motives in your book, Republicans seem to have long made a special effort to deprive African Americans of the right to vote. Now, there was a time when this was perhaps you could say a Democratic activity too in the Deep South, when the Democratic Party was dominant there in a different era. But in recent decades, it's the Republican Party and Republican judges who have sought to weaken the Voting Rights Act. It is Republicans who have sought to cage voters of color. It is Republicans who have sought to strike African American voters from the rolls, make it more difficult for voters of color to exercise their franchise, on and on and on. And I think it is important for people to understand that this is a racial justice issue as well as a democracy issue, that the way democracy is being undermined is by, I would say, reviving and reinforcing the racial assaults on our democratic process that really date back to the founding of our republic. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's Joe Madison says it's not Jim Crow anymore; it's James Crow ESQ.
Right.
And he's right. This has become, as I mentioned earlier, institutionalized. This is the principal go-to strategy of the Republican Party, is to suppress Democratic votes. And the Democratic Party is principally made up of working people, young people, people on Social Security and Medicare, older people, and people of color. And the most successful strategy that, in fact, frankly, I think that perhaps as many as a quarter of the elected Republicans across the United States are only in office because they've been able to rig the vote. And I realize that's a pretty shocking number, but it may be actually a conservative number if you look at the research that Greg Palast has done, for example.
Yeah, and I again, very important point, Thom. And I think that, for example, the fact that that number is going to be that estimate is going to be new to a lot of us is itself, to me, kind of an indictment of the way we as a progressive movement, as well as the Democratic Party, because it's not just their job, it's our job to get the word out, where we could do better. Because to me, all the fury and rage and energy that's gone into, for example, reports of Russian interference in our elections. I wonder why more people aren't feeling the same intensity of response to Republican interference in our election. I'm wondering, frankly, there's a part of me that understands I don't admire, but I understand the reaction of those senators that said, well, we're afraid if we tell them basically how broken our system is, people won't come out to vote. But my answer to that is, one, you have a constitutional duty to defend democracy, even if it doesn't feel expedient to you in the moment. And two, well, then explain to them, motivate them to get out there, tell them that their vote is the only thing standing between us and the total loss of our democracy. And I don't think that's blue sky. But I think it's, again, a departure that frankly requires work like yours that you put into this book, and maybe a different kind of, I don't want to say a different kind of Democrat, but a different kind of democratic approach to this issue. What are your thoughts?
I think it's time to take names and kick ass. I think
okay.
The Democratic Party needs to be assertive, loud, aggressive. They need to point out that this is election fraud. That's what we're talking about here. Fraud is a way of life for many Republicans. Donald Trump has been convicted of two different frauds, his charity and his university, and had to pay a $25 million fine and a $2 million fine. All three of his children had to go to 6 weeks of training on how not to run a fraudulent nonprofit. Fraud is, at the core of the Republican Party. They also, the frauds of, we are concerned about Social Security, but we want to privatize it. We are concerned about Medicaid, but we want to block grant it. We are concerned about Medicare, but we're pushing Medicare Advantage to privatize it. And I could give you a much longer list, but basically fraud is the currency of the realm in GOP land. And the Democrats need to be pointing that out aggressively, daily, loudly, repetitively, and without stop.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I guess I was just maybe phrasing it too politely. I appreciate your more direct approach. I think that it's always important. I am in constant battle with here I speak strictly for myself. I'm in constant battle with the Democratic establishment in this episode, not this segment, but this episode and others, and I won't stop that. But I think it's very important for people to understand that, in my view anyway, the Republican Party and the Republican establishment is the greatest threat to democracy that we face currently, and I think that we have to stop being wishy-washy about it. I think we have to call out everything, whether it's lying to voters or, in this case, stealing votes, stealing elections, stealing the election of Stacey Abrams, right?
Yeah, Republicans show up in the streets with semi-automatic weapons and torches, and Democrats call a meeting in somebody's living room. I mean, it's There's a little bit of a difference there.
It
I'm not
reminds
saying.
me, yeah, the difference in approach reminds me of the old Groucho Marx routine in one of their movies where a gangster threatens to kill him and he turns to someone and says, there'll be a letter about this in the Times tomorrow morning.
Exactly.
So, and again, we're talking with Thom Hartmann about his new book, The Hidden History of the War on Voting, which is the object I hold in my hand. And I would guess, again, these are short, digestible books. I would guess this is probably, what, 35,000, 40,000 words, something like that, Thom?
35, yeah.
Okay, not bad. When you write,
Right.
you get a feel for this, right? And which means you could buy it and probably read it on a flight from, I don't know, New York to Minneapolis or something, or to Chris Kobach's home state, so you could let him know that he is one of democracy's greatest enemies right now. Okay, now let's talk about red shifting, because that is one of the places I what's the word, dog-eared in this book. It's a very, very important phenomenon. I mean, I know it originates in astronomy, but we're not talking about that kind. We're talking about the fact that exit polls, pollsters usually did pretty well at polling people as they came out of the voting booth and say, who'd you vote for? And they'd say the Democrat, the Republican. They usually got it pretty close. But now what they do is they're always wrong, as you mentioned earlier, and virtually always in favor of the Republicans, who magically have more votes than the exit polling suggested and win elections that exit polling frequently shows they lost. Now the pollsters then say, oh, they just changed the number. But what's going on there? As you mentioned earlier, we thought it was the voting machines, but what do we think now?
Well, we started seeing this phenomena in a big way. I mean, there was a little bit of redshift in the 98 election. There was a little bit more, particularly in Florida, in the 2000 election. And we now know that that was probably accounted for. Everybody at the time thought that it was because the voting machines in Florida were rigged, but it turns out it was the 20 to 80,000 or 90,000 African Americans that Jeb Bush had Katherine Harris throw off the voting rolls in Florida because their names were similar to the names of felons in Texas, and which got George Bush in spitting range of stealing the election with the help of the Supreme Court. So, at the time, we didn't realize that that's what it was, that it was voter suppression. We just figured it was the machines. It got much larger in 2004. Ohio had a huge redshift in 2004. The exit poll showed that John Kerry easily won Ohio. When they actually counted the vote, they discovered that no, it was George W. Bush, and that's what gave him the White House. Turns out there were 180 some odd thousand provisional ballots in Ohio that were never even opened, much less counted. And this takes us back to 2002. In 2002, Bob Ney is a friend of mine, and he was one of the principal authors of the Help America Vote Act. He was a Republican congressman from Ohio at the time. And they wrote into this with the rationale that everybody should, if they go to the trouble of showing up at the polls to vote, they should be able to cast a ballot, and even if they're not on the rolls. So what they came up with was this kind of ballot called the provisional ballot, where you would, if you show up to vote and you're not on the voting rolls, you're given the provisional ballot, and it's set in a separate box. And what people are not told when they're given provisional ballots is that they are never counted unless there is unless the election is contested, unless there's a lawsuit to contest the election. And even then, most of them don't get counted, because if you're given a provisional ballot, depending on the state, the rules vary from state to state, but you typically have between 2 and 5 days after the election to show up at the Secretary of State's office and prove, give them your birth certificate, your passport, your driver's license, your proof of residence, and your proof that you used to be registered to vote in the state, an old voter registration card or something like that, and that you were improperly removed from the voting rolls. In that case, then they put a little check mark by your provisional ballot, and if the election gets contested, your ballot will be counted. But the fact of the matter is that, 99 out of 100, or probably more like 9,999 out of 1,000 people, don't go to the Secretary of State's office within the 5 days after they voted. They don't even know that they have to, and B, they think their vote was counted. And because they think their vote was counted, they don't understand what a provisional ballot is, when they walk out of the polling place and meet the exit pollster, who says, "Who'd you vote for?" They say, "Oh, I just voted for Al Gore, John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, whatever." And the exit pollster dutifully writes this down. And this is why, well, for example, in the 2016 election, it's in the book, Hillary Clinton won by substantial margins, according to the exit polls, in Florida and South Carolina, in Ohio and Wisconsin and Michigan. And yet in every one of those states, the election went to Donald Trump, which is why he's in the White House. There was substantial redshift. And I think probably all of it, or at least most of it, can be accounted for by voter suppression, by people being tossed off the voting rolls. With a sneaky little strategy that they've got where they mail you a postcard and the postcard looks like junk mail. But buried somewhere in that postcard, it says, if you don't return this postcard within a certain number of weeks, your name will be removed from the voting rolls. We're just trying to confirm that you still live in the state. Because they do have an obligation periodically to clean up the voting rolls and take off the names of people who've moved out of state or died. So, go ahead.
So we have, and again, we're talking with Thom Hartmann about the book, The Hidden History of the War on Voting. There are two important points to me that come out of that. One is, first of all, I just want to reiterate the racially biased nature of the way they strike people from the voting rolls because, quote unquote, their names resemble those. You have the process of saying, well, we think these voters are duplicates, or their names resemble those of other people in other states who are not qualified to vote. And to me, one of the important racial aspects of this is that there's an enormous diversity in nations of origin among white Americans, because they come from a variety of countries, have a variety of names and associations with them. Mine is, Ukrainian, Jewish, Americanized, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas, for example, African Americans have a much smaller pool of names from English slave owners, primarily.
Yes, primarily British and Irish.
Yeah, right, exactly. Hispanics have a smaller range of both first and last names, culturally speaking, so it becomes the perfect tool for striking people of color from the record. But the even larger question to me, and I never want to lose sight of the racism of this strategy, but the larger, after the trauma of the 2016 election, there was a lot of recrimination about the 1% of votes or so that went to Jill Stein, about the role of Russia, about the role of other parties. Did Bernie work hard enough? To me, it seems, and I'm willing to, of course, to be corrected if I'm wrong, it seems to me that those sorts of things receive far more energy than what might have changed the outcome without question, which is this process of basically sandbagging votes so that elections can be stolen. I would have liked to see the last 4 years focus on, we can do certain measures against foreign interference in our elections, and we should, but it seems to me the one thing we have the power to do politically, if we mobilize enough, even under these rigged circumstances, is to change these laws so that this doesn't happen to us again. And yet I've heard almost nothing about it from Democrats.
Right. Yeah, it is something that Democrats need to be focusing on, and focusing on strongly. Right now, the burden of proof is on you and me as voters to prove that we should be on the voting rolls. If there was legislation or even a constitutional amendment that said voting is a right in the United States, and the Motor Voter Act, by the way, of 1970, whatever it was, 74, I think, comes right out and says the voting is a right in the United States, but that's never been adjudicated by the Supreme Court, so it's not actually taken seriously, unfortunately. But if it was established that voting was a right, then the state would have the burden of proof, and they would have to demonstrate to you that you should no longer be on their voting rolls rather than the other way around. And that would put a kink in the Republicans' strategies. The other thing is we all need to be working to educate everybody that this is the principal way that Republicans are winning elections right now, outside of some, outside of Wyoming, outside of hard red enclaves. And therefore, number one, in the months leading up to the election, you need to check, and in pretty much every state, you can do this online. You need to check and make sure that your voter registration is current. And secondly, if you are given a provisional ballot at the polls, you need to absolutely raise screaming holy hell. Now, I don't mean abuse the poll workers, but get in social media, file complaints, go to the Secretary of State's office, call the newspaper, write a letter to the paper, tweet it, blog it, Facebook it, everything. We need to make provisional ballots a phrase that is as common in the United States as vaping. We need to push them to the top of the news in the next election cycle, because there are literally going to be millions of Americans, most of them people of color, students, college students, and people who are over 65, who are going to be given provisional ballots, and most of them won't know what that means, and they'll think that they voted. And we need to be informing them in advance so that this can be the election year. There's no way to stop it now. It's already baked in. Millions of people have been removed from the voting rolls just in the last year nationwide, and literally millions. And, so we need to be ready for this and use it as an opportunity to raise hell.
I think that's a great point. And there's one other dimension of this that I wanted to discuss with you, Thom Hartmann, before I let you go. We've talked about the racism. We've talked about the difficulty people, women and Native Americans and people of color had getting the right to vote in the first place. Some of us remember even as children, the civil rights struggles for the vote in the 1960s and so on. So we have all that. We know that Trump and people like Chris Kobach and other Republicans have worked very hard to disenfranchise people, which extends this racist history of voter suppression in the country. But there's an ideological element of it. You might remember, I don't think many of our listeners would, but in the 60s, there was a very wealthy oil man named H.L. Hunt, extremely conservative. And H.L. Hunt wrote what to him was a utopian novel about the perfect state called Alpaca. And in it, Hunt said, and I'm planning to write about it someday with a million other things. In it, among other things, Hunt says, well, only people with a great deal of property should be allowed to vote, and their vote should be portioned out based on the extent of their wealth. So, I guess if you have $10 to your name, you get 10 points. If you have $1 billion, you get 1 billion points. That's the logic. So, which is not, given the way campaign contributions and dark money works, not completely different from what we've got now. But I think there's an ideological element to this too, and I'm wondering your thoughts on it, that basically says, well, disenfranchising, poor people, black people, students, old people who don't have a lot of money, rural people who are struggling to get by. Well, we wealthy should control the world anyway. So when Chris Kobach tries to disenfranchise voters, or someone else does, we're really doing God's work. And I think, I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I'd be curious.
Well, there's a long history of this in the United States. In fact, it was debated in July of 1787 at the Constitutional Convention whether only property owners should be allowed to vote. And ultimately, they shot that down and left it up to the states. And there were quite a few states, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but there were several states that only allowed property owners, in fact, you had to bring a tax receipt, for example, to vote, to vote. That mostly went away in the late 1820s, early 1830s as a result of Andrew Jackson's presidency, of all things. He ran a very, very populist platform of essentially power to the people and death to the big banks, specifically the Second Bank of the United States, which he did kill. And part of his platform was passing federal legislation that would allow all white men to vote, not just those who had property, in all states. Now, he never passed that legislation, but what happened was the states that had limits on the ability of non-property owners to vote pretty much removed them from their constitution or from their laws during that roughly 10-year period, around and immediately after Jackson's presidency. So it's not so much an issue now, but John Adams supported that position. The second president of the United States, one of the founders of our republic.
I think
So
Hamilton was sympathetic too, wasn't he?
Hamilton, sure.
Your people, sir, is a great beast. Wasn't that Alexander Hamilton?
Yes,
But I feel somehow that there has been a historic tension in American politics or American history between a love of the people and a fear of the people as a democratic force. That there's
sure.
been, I think, for example, Walter Lippmann, the commentator of the early 20th century, who at one point thought the role of the media, he renounced it later, but the role of the media should be to he called the people, the public as a whole, the bewildered herd, and said the role of the media was to guide them to the positions that elite, business people and politicians and media people thought was best for them, and so on. So we have a long and troubled, in a way, or at least issue ideologically with the idea of full democracy. But to me, the clear and present danger is I can't put it, I know it's wise or considered wise to appear nonpartisan, but I don't say this from a particularly partisan point of view. It seems to me the clear and present danger to our democracy right now is the systematic Republican sabotage of democracy in its self-interest. That's my closing thought, but what's yours?
I completely agree with you, and we need, as citizens, and the Democratic Party as an institution needs to hoist that flag in the air and fly it high.
Well, one way to start is by reading this book, The Hidden History of the War on Voting, Who Stole Your Vote and How to Get It Back, by Thom Hartmann. That's this book here. So Thom, thanks for your great work in writing it, and thanks once again for coming on the Zero Hour.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure and honor to be on your program. I really appreciate it.